Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Implementation of Supply Chain Mapping and Traceability in Leather Supply Chains, Brand Experience. Today's presentation will be recorded and sent out to all registered participants and also be posted on the Hub. We will have a Q&A portion throughout the presentation. You can type your questions into the question box on the webinar doc. Now on to Nicole with Textile Exchange. Nicole?
Thank you, Rose. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Lambert, and it's a real pleasure for me to welcome you on behalf of Textile Exchange and the Responsible Leather Roundtable to our fifth webinar of our learning series on supply chain mapping and traceability in the leather supply chain. I'll just move on to the next slide. As Rose was mentioning, this webinar is focused on brand experience related to the implementation of supply chain mapping and traceability in their leather supply chains. So just before we start, and while we wait for maybe the last attendees to log in, I'll just read you through our Antitrust Statement. Textile Exchange convenes the textile community and values diversities of views, expertise, opinions, backgrounds, and experiences. It is expected that members of this community will collaborate by sharing ideas, information, and resources of publicly available information only, and avoid discussions on price, strategic plans, or other private and sensitive information. I'll let you read through our disclaimer, but basically the views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in this webinar belong solely to the speakers. And as the leader of the Responsible Leather Roundtable, Textile Exchange strives to maintain a neutral role. So Rose mentioned this, but I'll just a quick reminder. I'm sure everyone is very familiar with webinars and Zoom webinars by now, but this webinar is recorded. All participants are muted, but if you do have any questions or want to provide us with any feedback, please use the Q&A function in the Zoom toolbar, and Larissa will be monitoring them throughout the whole session. This webinar is recorded, and all the slides and the recording will be made available for you on the Textile Exchange website. So today we have yet again an amazing lineup of speakers. We have Carolyn Swenson from Reformation. She is the Senior Materials Manager for Leather. Nancy Tonk, Senior Analyst, Responsible Materials and Traceability at BF Corporation. And Yuan Rilan, Head of Sustainable Sourcing at Caring. And finally, Anne Gillespie, our one and only Director of Impact Acceleration at Textile Exchange. So I'll be kicking off this agenda with a short introduction. Then the brands that are with us today will give you a presentation on how they have addressed supply chain mapping and traceability in their leather supply chains. These presentations will then be followed by a panel discussion that will be moderated by Anne. And we will also make sure to keep a bit of time at the end of this webinar to answer any questions you may have at the end. So, as I was mentioning earlier, today's webinar is the fifth and also the last webinar of our learning series on supply chain mapping and traceability in the leather supply chain. Our previous webinars have touched base on what traceability is, why it is an important topic to tackle for all actors involved in the leather supply chain. We heard that traceability is a challenge brands want to address, and that sustainability standards used in the leather supply chain are focusing more and more on this topic and are gradually increasing the expectations they have of the leather supply chain. During our third webinar, we had several organizations present the services and tools they have developed to help the sector address supply chain mapping and traceability in the leather supply chain. And our last webinar focused on the challenges related to traceability at the farm level, with a very specific focus on cattle production in Brazil. And so what I'd like about today's webinar, being our last webinar, is that we're moving from what can be done and how things can be done in theory to how things actually play out in real life and in an actual functioning leather supply chain. And obviously, as everyone has experienced in life, I'm sure, there are often a bit of a gap between how we expect things will happen and then, due to the theory we've made about it, and then how things actually go in practice. And so I'm hoping that today's webinar will show you that although addressing supply chain mapping and traceability in the leather supply chain is challenging, it is also possible. And that the information that the brands with us today are generously sharing with the community on their experience may also provide you with some ideas on how to approach this topic in your leather supply chains. So just before I hand over to our first speaker, for those of you that have not had the opportunity to participate in our previous webinars of this learning series, do not worry. The webinars are all recorded and available for free on the Textile Exchange website. So you just need to go into the Industry Tools tab, and then you'll find them under the webinar archives. So moving on, it is a pleasure for me to introduce you to Carolyn Swenson. Carolyn works as a Senior Materials Manager of Footwear at Reformation. Her role is to define a footwear material supply chain that meets Reformation's sustainability standard and delivers beautiful, durable products. Caroline has about 20 years of experience in materials and supply chains and an educational background in environmental science and sustainability business. So without any further ado, the floor is yours, Caroline. I'll let you switch on your camera and unmute yourself.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Carolyn Swenson, as I was just introduced by Nicole. Thank you. I'm the Senior Materials Manager at Reformation. TE team, thank you so much for inviting us to speak today. We're really honored to share the stage with you, TE team, BF, and Caring, as you're all really defining leather traceability and pushing the industry forward. Thank you so much for your efforts. Your work has made entering into this space for a brand like Reformation less opaque, and I hope our collective efforts can help normalize some expectations around traceability in the industry. Can we move to slide 1, please? So this first slide you're seeing just lays out the flow of talking points that we'll discuss from our philosophy regarding leather traceability to a roadmap for the future. Okay, next slide, please. All right, just a bit about Reformation. For those of you, we've got a pretty international group of people attending the conference today. So many of you are possibly unfamiliar with the brand, so I'll tell you a bit about us. Ref started in 2009, selling vintage clothes out of a small Los Angeles storefront. We quickly expanded into making our own stuff with the focus on sustainability. Our products celebrate the feminine figure with effortless silhouettes while pioneering and trying to normalize sustainable practices, focusing on people and progress with each step of the way. We put responsibility at the center of everything we do. We aim to be transparent with our customers and recognize that the term sustainability is an evolving goal and definition. We don't have all the answers, but we want to focus on efforts that have the biggest impact, but we also don't forget the small things. We have about 23 retail stores primarily located in the United States, but we've expanded into Canada and the UK over the last few years. Our clients shop in store, but they are also quite digitally native, as online sales account for a large percentage of our business. In May 21, we relaunched our footwear collection with plans to expand into additional accessories in the near future. We're headquartered in Los Angeles. Next slide, please. So the first step in our traceability journey is to recognize and own impact. So we use leather primarily for our upper and lining materials in our footwear product. We also use leather for a small percentage of our garments. From an impact point of view, leather has a very big impact, and so it's an important part of our portfolio. From a volume point of view, we just relaunched our footwear collection in May 21, so the total business volume is quite small relative to our apparel fibers. We think of leather as a beautiful, versatile, durable material that's a product of the meat industry, but it has a big impact. Cattle ranching has been linked to deforestation, the capture of indigenous lands, biodiversity loss, and climate change, among others. I'm not going to spend time here delineating the impacts of the meat and leather industry because of the breadth and variation of data out there. But I'll also not be talking about the impacts of tanning, as today's conference is focused on traceability, but the impacts of using leather run the full life cycle of the product from birth to end of life. And at REF, we recognize the same, and we want to account for all stages. Next slide, please. So the next step in our traceability strategy is setting comprehensive policies to address impacts. 66 to 80% of a brand's environmental footprint comes from its choice of raw materials. I'm citing Hague Material Sustainability Index there. That includes leather. Much of the impact takes place at the cattle ranching stage. The key stepping stone to addressing these impacts is through traceability. As I mentioned earlier, we're a fairly young brand from a leather usage perspective, and in some ways that's an advantage because we're nimble, but our traceability program is young and we're learning a lot as we go. We adapt and we iterate as we learn. Our approach to developing a traceability program began as we built our supply chain, which helped form our forward-facing customer and supplier-facing policies. This work started before we launched product. We make footwear in Brazil, so our focus was to build a supply chain in the south of Brazil. This was to minimize the association with deforestation in the Amazon and Cerrado biomes, but also because there's quite a few advantages to building a supply chain near the factories with which you work. So our policies, we require traceability to the slaughterhouse. We require knowledge of slaughterhouses as a first step towards knowing our full chain of custody. We know our farms. For clarification, we are connected to our farms through our slaughterhouse, and our leather agents have helped connect those dots. And when I say to the farm, I'm talking about the first layer. These are the finishing farms. We don't know back to the birth farms. We aim to know our farms because we want to take responsibility for land use and animal welfare practices. We have a zero tolerance policy for sourcing out of the Amazon. We do not accept hides that are sourced from the Amazon, Cerrado, or Pantanal biomes. We prefer to work with hides from the south of Brazil, from the Rio Grande do Sul area, primarily the Pampas biome. Next slide, please. So the next step in our traceability journey is identifying a compliant traceable supply base. In order to execute on the policies that we set in place, we identified and nominated partners far out the supply chain who are willing and eager to comply with our sourcing and traceability policies. Then we established a feasible, repeatable standard traceability audit process. The two graphics that you see featured here, the one on the left is our leather supply chain map, and the graphic on the right is our chain of custody, which maps from the farms all the way down to the finished leather suppliers. Next slide, please. So this slide outlines a very important audit process that we use to validate our supply chain information and hold ourselves and our suppliers accountable to providing accurate data. The traceability documentation is facilitated by our trader flowing from the farm to the finished tannery, and then an internal REF representative validates through random audit process the information working backwards from finished tannery back to the slaughterhouse and the farm. We manage this documentation validation internally, and it's time consuming and very paper heavy. This is very manual. And as we move into the next years and the next stage in our traceability journey, we're looking at third-party services that our traders and partners could use to help manage the flow of information, whether it's software, blockchain, or forensic. We're still, looking for some advice and guidance from our third-party supporters. Next slide, please. So as we identified our supply chain and we have an audit process in place, the next step in our journey was to complete a third-party risk assessment of our supply base, because it's always good to have an objective third party come in and just validate what you're seeing is accurate and call out blind spots. So we asked for National Wildlife Federation's help in this process, and they ran a risk assessment focused on our potential supply shed of our meat packers. And they provided us learnings that we overlay and help identify risk areas within our supply chain. And these areas that we need to pay attention to directly are at the edge of the Mata Atlantica biome and the Pampas region in the south of Brazil. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm running a little bit over, but I'm almost done. So with our foundation established, we're looking to additionally focus on animal welfare and land use. So as we enter into 2022, we've defined our short and long-term goals. These goals define what we consider progress in the traceability and animal welfare and land use space. We recognize the progress in the animal welfare space and land use space requires a long-term commitment and will require cross-industry collaboration and on-the-ground support as we move the needle towards measurable progress. As we enter into 2022, we kick off our midterm goals with the investment in third-party support to define, measure, execute, and help validate our progress. In order to achieve these goals, we'll have to lean heavily on third parties like LEA and on-the-ground partners. And with that, I want to thank you all for your time. And I'm looking forward to hearing from Caring and BF, who are trailblazers in this space of traceability and on-the-ground improvements within the leather supply chain. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. That was really great and so amazing to hear how you at Reformation tackled this from the very beginning of your journey with leather. So very a new approach. So our next speaker is Nancy Tonk. Nancy works as a senior analyst for VF's Responsible Materials and Traceability team. And Nancy runs traceability surveys to define VF's supply chains for leather and synthetics, as well as runs VF's public product mapping. She also supports the VF brands develop internal tools to track sustainable material certification. Her background is in fashion trend forecasting and product safety compliance, but has now shifted her career to focus on sustainability. Nancy, thank you so much for being with us today. I'll let you unmute yourself and take over.
Yes, thanks so much. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well today. Hope you're happy, healthy, and safe. So as she shared, my name is Nancy Tong. I'm senior analyst for VF's traceability team. I'm based in Hong Kong, which means I work closely with my team over here on our material sourcing teams to define our key material origins upstream. So since joining the team about 3 years ago, I've been running our annual leather survey. So I hope I can give you some insight into our program. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thanks. So for some of you who are not familiar with VF Corporation, just give you a bit of background. We oversee a profile of apparel, footwear, and accessory brands in active, outdoor, and workwear. So we connect our deep sense of purpose through the organization to power movements of sustainable and active lifestyles for the betterment of people and our planet. And the goal is reflected in the commitment to understanding the impact of our sourcing within our supply chains. Essentially, we cannot fix what we do not know. So our Responsible Materials and Traceability team was formed 4 years ago to tackle this issue. Our vision for the team is in traceability is that we will have the foundation to an honest and accountable supply chain. As a leader in proactive transparency, we will identify and enable on social and environmental risks and communities in need. And we do this through a series of key programs. One of them is our material sourcing policy development. We run the forest-derived material, animal-derived material, cotton policies at VF. We also do our sustainable product claims in relation to certified materials, a lot of which in relation to the TE standards. We also, as she mentioned before, have a brand product mapping, which is a massive effort from our whole traceability team and our brand partnerships. And lastly, we run our key material mapping, which is the focus of my presentation today. Would you mind to go to the next slide, please? So within our brand profile, a number of brands use leather. A majority of the leather is in footwear, as I've highlighted there with some Vans and Timberland styles, typically on the uppers or trims like shoelaces. We also have a number of accessories or equipment which use leather trims, including packs, as you see here, and gloves. So majority of the leather is sourced through our nominated Tier 2 finishing tanneries, and these are established through long-term relationships held by our material sourcing teams. Essentially, our sustainability targets in relation to leather, we outline all of our goals and targets in our annual Made for Change Sustainability Strategy. If anyone's interested, you can check out on vfc.com. For VF Corporation level, we have achieved 100% of all footwear leather to be finished at LWG, or Leather Working Group, audited tanneries. And specifically on the brand side, as a founding member of LWG, our Timberland brand has committed that they will only be sourcing leather from gold or silver Leather Working Group rated tanneries. And our leather material sourcing team tracks all of the LWG audited facilities to ensure that we're meeting targets, both corporate and brand level. If you could go to the next slide, please. So in addition to tracking LWG usage to address our traceability, we have been conducting deeper dive evaluations annually. And why for this reason? Carolyn outlined a lot of the reasons in hers, but I will repeat here. Leather, like most materials, has environmental and social risks associated with deforestation, biodiversity, land protection, water risk, land grabbing, etc. We have existing policies in our outlined in our ADM and human rights commitment. And our approach is to conduct the annual surveys for all of our key materials, which includes leather. For this year, we're just wrapping up the survey. We focus on checking the LWG status again. We also confirm that the ADM policy is followed and assess any social or labor risks within the supply chain. And the survey questions include material tracking practices, including document tracking, facility-specific questions about certifications, and importantly, nominating their upstream suppliers. We also partner with our VF teams, including our worker rights group and our environmental sustainability team, to include some of the questions that they would like to learn from the Tier 3 and upstream on policies and practices. So I'll walk you through in the next slide what this survey process looks like. So with our third-party software vendor, we've co-developed a survey system, which essentially sends an online form to suppliers. We have practiced different formats and methodology, but this year we think is working really well. It sends an online form from a vfc.com email address. Essentially, the first step is we partner with our sourcing team to define the scope and develop any questions. Typically, questions year to year are the same. We look at the different policies, company or brand commitments, as well as industry issues or changes. The next step is adding all of those suppliers or contacts to the management system, emailing out. I do this in partnership with my teammate Lindsay this year. And we typically give the suppliers about 2 to 3 weeks to reply to the survey. The last step is after each of the surveys have been submitted by the suppliers, the management system AI, which is developed with the software team, will help us standardize supplier names. This is actually quite a tricky pain point to match names. Maybe many of you have seen those hit the same pain point as us. And they also enables us to have a growing database upstream. And we're also piloting an AI risk flagging feature from a list designed by us. So it could be company names, regions, survey responses, etc., that shows us any risks flagged in the survey. So following this initial AI assessment, we work with our material sourcing teams, share them all of our findings. If any clarifications are required, we can go back to the suppliers. And we also have a massive global team called Sustainable Operations who can arrange visits to the facilities to do any validations. This can be a challenge due to travel restriction right now, but we do the best we can as everyone is doing now. To dig a little bit more into that fourth step about our survey method, I wanted to share my approach on the next slide. So what we manage is what cascading survey method. So starting with the tier 1 or 2, we ask the supplier, who do they source from? Once they disclose their tier 3, who's typically an agent or a wet blue tannery, we will send them a survey, and they will, we always keep the relationship holders CC'd. This allows the trust because they already see a relationship holder who they know, and we continue that process back upstream. As many of you know in this call, the leather tracking to tier 5 to the farm level can be a challenge. So our focus in these years has been to define to the slaughterhouse. We are able to define cattle aggregators and some farms through our regenerative leather pilots held by the Timberland brand, as the hide broker holds relationships and can facilitate that survey distribution. And conducting the survey this year, it takes some time. Ultimately, we were able to send everything out and complete the collection within 10 weeks. And then we don't really have any timeline on assessments. We take it case by case as it goes. If you could go to the next slide. Our endeavor in this next year is we're in a very early stage to define a risk monitoring tool. We've used some tools in the past, but they've been lacking on some customizable features that we really would like. So our goal in this tool is to allow us to upload directly all the raw data that we collect through the surveys. It will also allow us to showcase some dashboards like Sankey diagrams, pie charts, etc. We'll be able to overlay third-party data like deforestation fronts, protected areas, and also align with our human rights assessments conducted through Maplecroft data sets and Article 1 assessments. So yes, I hope that I was able to share as much as possible in the short time, but thank you so much. Yes, and look forward to learning about Keering's next.
Thank you, Nancy. That was fantastic. And I have so many questions, but I know that Anne is going to dig into some of them later on. So we're up to our last speaker today, Johan Regent. Johan works as Head of Sustainable Sourcing in the Kering's Sustainability Programs team. He works closely with the Kering luxury houses, their suppliers and various external stakeholders to build raw material supply chains that meet the highest standards in terms of environmental stewardship, biodiversity, conservation, and respect of animal welfare. And all of this through the implementation of innovative projects and initiatives. So I'm sure leather is not an exception to that. Johan has a background in sustainable sourcing, renewable energy and circular economy, and an educational background in industrial ecology. Johan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. You can just set the slides. Perfect. So just introducing Kering in the next slide. Thank you. So first of all, I want to thank DE for inviting us to speak here. It was super inspiring also to hear both Nancy and Caroline on the endeavors, definitely recognizing some of the challenges we have also in Kering when it comes to leather transparency and traceability. So it's good to hear, we all have the same challenges coming up to us. So for those who don't know Kering, Kering is a global luxury group that manages the development of a series of luxury houses in fashion, leather goods, jewelry, and watches. So just to name a few, we have Gucci, Saint Laurent, Bottega Veneta, Balenciaga, etc. in the group. And when it comes to our ambition and our vision, sustainability is embedded from the start because Kering's goal is to position themselves as the world's most influential luxury groups in terms of creativity, sustainability, and long-term financial performance. So having these three dimensions of innovation, sustainability, and financial results working together. When it comes to the sustainability strategy, rather than me talking through it, I'll ask Anne to play a video in the next slide, just to go through our
At Kering.
Yeah, you can go.
When we say luxury, we mean sustainable. This has been our vision from the very first time, one that is shared by our teams all over the world. In 2017, we have committed ourselves to reducing our ecological footprint by 40% by 2025. So we are working to achieve that goal every single day. Because becoming aware of our impact is the first step towards reducing it, we are measuring our footprint at every stage of what we do, from the production of our raw materials to the presentation of the collections in our boutiques. This is how we learned that our supply chain generates 93% of our footprint. So that is where we are focusing our efforts. In Mongolia, we implemented a sustainability program that is better for the environment, the animals, and the herders. In New Zealand, lamb's wool and sheep wool are getting all our attention. And in China, it's silk. In order to inventory and promote the most sustainable fabrics, we have founded a library of 3,800 textile samples that we update constantly. But to reach our goals, we have to do even more, to innovate and to come up with new solutions and new models. That's why we nurture startups that are shaking up the worlds of fashion and luxury. And we are raising awareness in up-and-coming creative minds thanks to partnerships with the most renowned schools of fashion. Because our idea of sustainability goes beyond the environment.
I'll just take it over from here. So just some key learnings from the video. Basically, as Nancy and Caroline has mentioned, basically our impact relays into our supply chain, and within the supply chain lays in really the farming and the agricultural landscapes where we get our raw materials from. So that's why this topic of traceability and transparency is very crucial, because if you want to tackle your impact, you need to know where your material is coming from. Then additionally, for caring, leather is, of course, our first raw materials in terms of sourcing, but in terms of image, in terms of revenues as well, through the sales of our leather goods and shoes. So focusing on leather when it comes to traceability and tackling our impact is, of course, a priority. So if you go to the next slide.
At Caring, when we...
Yeah, thank you. So basically our approach is relying on 4 pillars when it comes to handling our impact on leather. And I wouldn't say these are sequential. I think they basically work all together. I'm just presenting them in a sequential way because I have to present them somehow. So the first of all, I think, and somehow the starting point is engagement. And here I mean engagement in 2 ways. Is our engagement in terms of our ambition and our goals. So for each of our materials, Caring has developed what we call the Caring standards for materials, which are basically our strategy raw material by raw materials to reach by 2025 when it comes to raw material sourcing, and that we keep updating every year. So basically it lays out either standards and certifications, such as the set of TE standards and certifications, or sometimes practices, raw material by raw material, that have to be achieved by 2025. When it comes to leather, for instance, as you know, there isn't a certification that covers the impact of leather from farm to finished product. So it's more giving guidance to traceability, type of sourcing, type of farming, tanning, so impact across the supply chain. And we have an ambition to reach 100% of compliance to these standards by 2025. And engagement is also meant by engaging your supply chain. I think that's the first step into working with transparency and traceability, is making sure that, first of all, your suppliers know what are your expectations and goals and standards, and then are onboarded. And so in order to do that, we have developed, a bit similarly to what Nancy presented, a platform to engage with the suppliers that we, through which we can submit survey, we can ask them questions about their practices, both on the environmental, economic and social aspects, questions about traceability and animal welfare. So that's kind of the first step. And beyond that, we also have individual engagement or group engagement workshops on topics such as tanning, but also traceability, and in the future as well, animal welfare. So that's kind of the first cornerstone of our strategy. And then once you've built this engagement in terms of goal and working with suppliers, the second step is transparency. And for me, there is quite a difference between transparency and traceability. Transparency or visibility is gaining the visibility to understand from where your material is coming from when it comes to farms and abattoirs, while traceability is more like the physical traceability of, let's say, hide from its starting point to the finished product. So when it comes to transparency, the way we work, specifically in our leather supply chain, or through a survey towards our suppliers, asking them, and when I mean suppliers, I mean the tanneries we're sourcing from, whether or not they are in-house or outside of Kering, asking them to map basically their supply chain and to disclose the supply chain down to the abattoirs, and in some specific cases as well to farms. Actually, the image is an actual snapshot of the mapping we've done in the last years in Europe. So we've seen a lot of slaughterhouses mapped across Europe. We also have some outside Europe, even though most of our sourcing as Kering is quite European-centric. So that's kind of the second step. And this is a very important step because based on this one, this is how we also developed risk mitigation strategies based on, where these abattoirs are located, what kind of, a legal framework they have in the countries when it comes to environmental and animal welfare. If the abattoirs are located in an area that can present some environmental risks, we can also assimilate by proxies that the farms that are supplying these abattoirs also are, so that we define our priorities. The third pillar will be on traceability, and here it's more implementing actual physical traceability solutions in the supply chains. Full disclosure, it's still not something that's everywhere in the supply chain. It's more pilots that we're trying to scale up through different technologies, such as this is an actual picture of a laser marking solutions we've been testing in an area of our supply chain to basically be able to then verify and convene some information within these traceable marks, for instance. So in these markings, it's not just to have a mark on the skins, it's also to put information about, what type of farming was done, what were the type of slaughterhouses that the animals been through, etc., so that you can basically enrich the information as you go up in the supply chain. And finally, innovation. And here I mean it more in a way as what are the new solutions that can support traceability innovatively. So it's not innovation for innovation, it's innovation for a purpose. So it's either new innovative ways to, for instance, trace the hides, mark the hides through, any kind of new upcoming technologies that have been presented in the previous TE webinars. It can also be more like software support solutions, blockchain traceability solutions, etc. So basically, this is putting it at the end because I think it's important to start from the basic and not just try to put innovation at the start, because you basically need to have a level of visibility before you go through trying to implement innovative solutions. So I think I'm actually at the top of my time. So thank you very much for the time you gave me. Of course, I'm available for any questions. And I would like to thank again TE and the other speakers for the insights shared.
Thank you, Johan. That was fantastic, super interesting. It's not finished. We will now be moving on to our panel discussion. So this will be an opportunity to kind of dig a bit deeper into certain aspects of how these brands, Kering, VF and Reformation, were able to implement the solutions and the strategies they have in their leather supply chains. So I'd like to ask our panelists, all our speakers, to unmute themselves and to switch on your cameras. And I will then let Anne take over from here.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you for pulling together a great set of speakers. And it's nice to see the variety of approaches and sizes and stages. And I'm sure that this audience on this webinar represents the entire spectrum of, starting the whole journey to being fairly advanced, to having either simple or complicated supply chains. So I wanted to ask the panelists, first of all, just to really dig into, particularly for those who are going to start their journey, what are some of the internal challenges, getting the buy-in, lining up the resources, even giving us a sense of the scale of effort that was needed and what types of departments and people and roles within your organizations were needed to implement the different layers of traceability, because they all represent pretty serious efforts. So we can go on a voluntary basis. Does anybody want to reply to that?
I can start just because we're kind of, I would say on this journey, we're quite early on relative to carrying and BF. And we're also smaller, significantly smaller. So, you know, like I said, we relaunched our footwear collection in May of 21, but we were working on our leather supply chain and getting buy-in from all of the stakeholders, probably a good year before launch. And Reformation, we're in a unique place where sustainability is kind of our #1 deciding point. So having a leather supply chain that we felt good about was like the first piece of the puzzle. But in terms of time and sacrifice, you know, when you want to have traceability in your supply chain, you don't have the variety of options that maybe you would if you just went to the leather fair and were just picking from a fashion perspective purely. And then in terms of like time and nimbleness, you also sacrifice because we have a very narrow supply chain. So, you know, there's some challenges there, right? We rely on them doing all of their due diligence. We also don't have somebody that we can jump to if they're having some issues within their supply chain. And then in terms of a time commitment standpoint, we have somebody in Brazil that's on the ground that spends a good portion of their time just kind of managing this audit process and traceability process. So it's an investment. We think it's worth it, but you definitely need to know what you're getting into and have buy-in from the top because it will, you know, require financial investment and definitely a time investment.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I could see all that. And then maybe to switch over to you, Nancy, because you're as a Timberland and a VF, sorry, with a corporation that's got a long, long history, the focus on traceability has been really a transition. How did that go about for you guys?
I can say that I actually wasn't at VF when they started the leather traceability program. So I'm not sitting in Carolyn's position to work in the buy-in. When I joined, our director, Chanel, had established the survey. She had done already a lot of on-the-ground, on-site visits. So I think still the challenge was to define how we best work with our material sourcing teams, because those are the ones who are representing on behalf of the brands to the suppliers, right? Working with them to see how can we best include them in our development scope, which are the key suppliers to contact, and keep them, allow them the visibility to our surveys and our interaction without actually giving them more work. So the system that I went through, because we work in parallel, so I would say the system that we set up is essentially we can always keep them or the key stakeholders internally in copy to the supplier. So the supplier is never sure who I am. They've never met myself or my colleague, Lindsay, who send out the survey. At least they have a trustworthy person that they can go to. So that has been very helpful so far to work on those established relationships and build the process around that.
Great. And maybe while I've got you on this topic, I was very interested to see your cascading surveys. And you know, in principle, that's what we've always said, you know, is how you do it. But I've always wondered about the reality of getting everybody to reveal who their sources are. And has that been a real roadblock?
I can say, yeah, it's now 3 years. It is getting better and better. I would say for those of you starting the journey, just be patient. It's hard. It's hard right away because you might even listen to our 3 stories and think we're really established. Like, but is what has already been said is it is a journey. So I can say our goal is to get to the slaughterhouse. We do strive to even get past that. But if we have found some people will write back and say it's NDA, there's confidentiality issues with revealing the specific company names, but I will always request at least give us a location. Try to get, you know, the region, city, the country, definitely the country, and that we can apply that to our geospatial mapping so we can overlay any risks.
Good. And then Johan, what about caring? I mean, you guys seem in an enviable position because there's such a deep commitment to sustainability, like all of these companies, but also one that's been there for a while and well-resourced. But I'm assuming that there have been some logistical challenges, and maybe explain also who drives the traceability work and where it's embedded in the organization.
Yeah, of course. I think, yeah, there are internal and external challenges. I think internally, it's more around explaining why you want to do this traceability work and this transparency work, giving the reasons behind that, and also making the people realize you don't do it only for sustainability. Actually, this can be valuable for many other things, quality, other types of risk evaluation. So I think it's important to just like embed that in a more holistic approach. That way you kind of win some more buy-in from the rest of the organizations. When it comes to how we are setting up internally, so internally it's basically a collaboration between the sustainability and what we call operations team, centrally here at Caring, but also brands by brands. So our brands and fashion houses internally help to do this exercise, because they are the ones who have the relationship with the suppliers. And that's kind of the base of everything. You need to have, of course, the trust of the tanneries in order for them to be willing to share that information. As Nancy said, at the beginning, the first time you ask them, of course, they will also say, oh, no, that's confidential information. I don't want to share it, because they're also kind of worried of why you want this information. They are, of course, scared of being shortcutted or anything. So it's important to give the context about why you want this information and what you're going to do with it, to be quite transparent about the purpose of what you're going to do. And then I think progressively you're going to reach your objectives. I mean, we didn't set, so we are still on a journey, to have 100% mapping to the slaughterhouse, and we really set ourselves as staircase model to have a progressive approach. We knew that, the first year we wouldn't get to 100%. And I think it's also kind of wise also to work with more established tanneries, the big ones, when you have big relationships, and then you kind of work your way through the small ones, because you've also gained knowledge on how to best approach them and engage with them.
And maybe a question, I'm kind of going through the carrot, the stick question, obviously just when you ask something and you're a major customer, they're going to be very motivated to follow through in your request. But would you go to the point of not working with particular vendors if they are not willing to share information at some point?
I mean, not based on the non-sharing information. I mean, we have in our vendor rating portal, we actually give a score to the vendors, and that includes sustainability and traceability dimension. That's used by the sourcing team for the decision. So they will base the decisions also based on that. Am I going to say that they're going to stop sourcing? I'm not sure, but I think most of our main suppliers and key suppliers have understood, not only because we are asking, but basically because the entire industry is asking them the same thing. So they have also an interest in getting ready to share that information, because then I think they are ready to pass it over. I think the next step is maybe for us as an industry to understand, okay, what's the best way to work collectively on, common tools, common reporting. Because I think there is also this sometimes, and it's understandable, this fatigue from the tanneries and the suppliers about having to fill up the same 100 surveys from 100 different clients, asking basically almost the same thing, but not exactly in the same way. So yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a perfect setup for what we're trying to do with the Leather Impact Accelerator, is to identify what are some of those common tools, and obviously give a choice, but be sure that they're well vetted, the same way we've done with the different social and environmental standards. And I think that is the next step. And certainly if anybody, including people listening to this, if you have any suggestions for us at Textile Exchange on what are some of the ways that we can support you to communicate back to your supply chain, to develop tools, to share any other kind of information or learnings or templates or anything you'd like, please put it into the Q&A box or contact us separately, because that's really what we're here to do. So then, getting back into the supply chain itself, we've talked a little bit about there's been, some resistance to not wanting to share their information. Have they been challenged? And maybe Nancy, in your cascading strategy, they will cascade. So you'll ask supplier level 1 to tell you about supplier level 2, and then supplier level 2 to tell you about supplier level 3. But when we look at the leather supply chain, sometimes they can really have a lot of change even within a given season in terms of who they're buying from at particular stages in the supply chain. Does that ever become an issue, or are there any specific pushback that you get from the supply chain when you're asking for this?
That's a good question. I have compared the suppliers historically, because the system that we use has this, my favorite nerdy function, which is it dynamically updates Sankey diagrams, so we can see all of the relationships. So I can compare year to year. And I can say that I don't see that big of a change year to year. I can say sometimes what the suppliers that are really challenging is when we come into an agent who is not the facility who's running the tannery or the processing facility, but they're shipping from A to B. So those are usually the suppliers that I'm quite interested in to learn more about. Yeah, I guess that's one of the areas that.
And then maybe well, back to Carolyn or Johan, what about at your end? And does anybody run into subcontracting or virtual tanning operations?
I don't know if I'm happy to. You
Yep.
mean that the subcontractors? Yeah, I mean, yeah, it definitely has the layers of difficulty, and I mean, it's not only subcontractors. I mean, you do know that in the leather industry, you have also a lot of traders and intermediaries that can also be sometimes. They can be, I think, as interesting. I think as Caroline presented, I think they can be an accelerator or an obstacle, depending on how you engage them as well, because they all usually have the capacity and the relationship and the network to actually get this information, and also convince maybe different people in the supply chain to disclose that information. So I think actually Caroline's example is quite interesting in the way that they have managed to get more information because of this trader they're working with. So I think it's sometimes, two ways. I mean, it can be an obstacle, but it can also sometimes be an accelerator. I don't know, Caroline, if you want to share more about this.
Yeah, Carolyn.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, again, having that narrow supply chain just because of our scale has been beneficial for us, because this trader that we're working with is looking at some consistent business going all the way through the supply chain that they're helping, they're kind of managing from pre-tanning to tanning. They're involved in all of the steps. So I think from an economic standpoint and for carving a unique place out in the industry for themselves, it's very beneficial. In terms of transparency, I think, again, with our supply chain, we've asked a lot of questions and it's taken us time, but we've gotten the information that we need. The challenge is always validating, but when we go to meeting new tanneries, definitely there's always a resistance to sharing the supply chain, getting that full chain of custody. Nobody wants to give that up. So, trying to find the way to be transparent with them and say, the motivation is pure. We're not going to go behind your back and mess with your business flow. We're coming at this from an industry best practices standpoint. And I always kind of leverage, there's a changing tide in the industry. Big players like Caring and VF are asking for transparency. So it would behoove you to kind of get on board and open yourselves up to this.
Great. So I'm going to go off script a little bit, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about the traceability at the farm level, which is, all of this traceability is aiming to get back to the farm level. But as we've seen in some of the previous webinars, there's up to 3 levels of farming. The cow can be born on a birthing farm, spend a good portion of its time on a raising farm, and then eventually end up at the finishing farm, which is where it's goes from there to the slaughterhouse. So a lot of times when you're tracing back to your slaughterhouse and looking at the first level of farming, it's just to the direct farms. So I'm wondering what level of focus each of you is putting on those indirect farms, where you're sourcing from countries that's an issue.
Yeah, I think it's a very, you're going to have different questions, I guess, from the three of us, and even within our supply chains, I think the layout is very different, the structure is very different. As you said, in most of the case, you know, the animal, I mean, can go from 1 to 3 farms. It depends on the type of production. I think at Caring, what's most important is we tend to focus on the farm where the animal spends most of his life. So for instance, as we do quite a significant amount of calf leather, we are not necessarily looking so much at the birth farm where the calf is basically not going to stay along, but more for the raising farm. It's not really a finishing farm because it's where it's raised, and because that's also where any kind of impact, both environmental, social, and animal welfare will happen. So I think it's more in terms of how long the animal is there, and then what's the impact for the animal health and for the environment you want to focus on. Of course, it would be interesting as well to have the information about the birth farm, but that's something that is sometimes even impossible to get. So I think, yeah, sometimes you need to be a bit more pragmatic on your approach and just choose where it makes more sense to focus on.
Great. Carolyn or Nancy, what are your approaches?
I was going to say, for our approach, up until now, we've really been focusing on defining the slaughterhouse, but we're quite excited that some of our brands, specifically Timberland, is doing regenerative leather. So having and scaling up these kind of regenerative programs allows us to have more visibility to the farms and thereby understand a bit more about the structure that they have.
Great. And Carolyn?
So we're focused for now on just tracing back, making that connection via GTA from slaughterhouse to what we're calling the finishing farm. It's not fully clear to us how much time is being spent on the finishing farm and what, specifically we need to roll out, like feedlot versus farm, and then understand the full life cycle of the animal where they're spending it. There is some, based on our conversations with people in the leather industry, we understand that the cattle should be staying in the south of Brazil for the majority of their life. From an economic standpoint, it doesn't make a lot of sense to be shipping from, Brazil's a large country, from the north down to the south. But we have a lot of work to do in that space to really track back to the birth farm and understand the full life cycle of the animal. And that's why I think investment in on the ground support within your regions where you're buying your hides from is so important, because you need somebody that understands the region and is there checking for you. We're in the United States, so in 22 that will be our next step.
So I realize I've been hogging the space.
Hi,
so
interrupting you.
Yeah, I realize I've kind of got a Q&A been ignoring. So
I know. And I think we might not have time to, there are a couple of questions that have been asked by the audience, and we'll make sure to answer them offline. We'll make sure they're available online as well for everyone to see, and we'll send them to the right people. But thank you so much. This was amazing. Yes. Thank you to all the speakers, and thank you also really to being so willing to share your experience. I think it's very valuable for everyone. So thanks a lot for that. And just before we close, I just wanted to remember everyone that we have our Textile Exchange annual conference, which will be in Dublin this year, scheduled November 15th to 19th. As a part of the conference, we have our Responsible Leather Roundtable Summit on that Friday, so November 19th from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Irish Standard Time. You can come in person if you'd like to attend, or also participate virtually. Larissa, I'll just ask you to put the link to the registration to the conference in the Q&A so everyone has access to that. We recommend that everyone registers prior to November 8th, just to make sure that you all have, access to the links and everything before the time, before the conference actually starts. So thank you again for attending this webinar, and thank you again to our amazing speakers. And I also wanted to give a big shout out to Larissa and Rose, who are in the background but making all these webinars possible. So thank you, both of you as well. And so I'll be wishing you all a lovely day, and I'll hand it back to Rose.
Wonderful. Thank you again to our speakers, and thank you for participating in today's webinar. Again, as a friendly reminder, an email will be sent to all registered participants, excuse me, with a link to today's presentation. Also, I just want to highlight that in that email, pardon me, there will be an opportunity for you to maybe provide additional feedback or questions or anything that you would like to continue in regards to the conversation started here. That concludes our webinar. Thank you. Goodbye.
Yeah.